Okay, now could I ask Raquel and Zakila to come here and we'll have a special presentation. Please come here.
So on behalf of the Hazara Human Rights Forum, Rahila and I are here to take this special moment to say a special thank you to Ms. Dorothy for her ongoing support towards the Hazara community. Not only has she been a great support for the Hazara community, but especially those boys and girls who have been studying at Holroyd High School. We'd like to present her with a small token of appreciation for assisting and encouraging so many people to achieve their goals, no matter what struggles and challenges they are faced with. One of such individual is Rahila herself, who was a student at Holroyd High School and who's managed to receive her professional, she's managed to achieve professional success and she's working as a podiatrist at the moment. So many other people like Rahila have successfully come out of Holroyd High School as a teacher, doctor, engineer and so on, because it's Ms. Dorothy, like Ms. Dorothy, who support who are able to do such things. So we'd like to kindly welcome Ms. Hogwarts to come on stage and receive a small token.
Thank you very much. This was quite unexpected. I didn't, when I registered for this event, I didn't expect that I would receive such a wonderful gift and acknowledgement from people whose lives I've touched. I retired 3 months ago as principal of Holroyd High School. You have to retire at some point in your life, I guess. But I've only retired from paid employment, you'll be pleased to hear. And I am now on the board of Career Seekers, which is mentoring a number of young people here today. And I'm also working with a number of community organisations to support young refugees. Just briefly about Holroyd High, it has been a school which has provided huge opportunities for young people for a long time, and for many years something like 60% of all the students in the school have been either refugees or of refugee background. That means that perhaps the father came as an asylum seeker and has brought his children and his wife to Australia afterwards to settle here. There are some issues which I think we need to pursue and which are very important, which are engaging my mind at the moment. One is the suspension of benefits to asylum seekers, which is impoverishing people and putting them into a starvation situation. Particularly has impacted upon, of course it impacts everybody that it affects, but it's particularly impacted on that small number of young asylum seekers for whom I've been able to gain full university scholarships over the last 4 years, and who are now left without any financial support, although they have their scholarships and in some cases accommodation and sustenance at university. And I'm aware that young people are dropping out of university as a consequence of that. The other is the continuing injustice for people who are permanent residents but not yet Australian citizens, in terms of having to pay their higher education contribution scheme payments up front and not able to defer them as other members of the community are. Might make a lot of difference to people with wealthy backgrounds, but it certainly has a huge impact on people from poorer backgrounds. And many, as you know, many of our Hazaras are from poorer backgrounds, as well as almost everyone who's a refugee, because you arrive with so little. The good news, however, is that although so many students have arrived at schools like Holroyd with such huge disadvantage, from Holroyd for the last 3 years we've been averaging 60% university first round offers from our year 12 students, and I think that's quite remarkable given that the national average education is the real circuit breaker for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. It makes a difference in everyone's lives. After all, you can't take away an education from someone once they have a look at these two wonderful girls, and I look around here and I can see other familiar faces as well. But it is the game changer, And so it is particularly important that young refugees receive the full education so that they can reach their potential. My experience with young refugees is that their gratitude for their opportunity means that they wish to return the privilege of their education to the community. And I see every day examples of that altruistic spirit among our young refugee people who've gained an education. But this is an enormous pleasure to receive this. Thank you very much. My work has been so important to me. It's changed my life as well. And I have to say, the Hazara community, which is the largest ethnic group at Hori, the Hazara community has also changed my life. And I'm very grateful for having been able to work with you.
Well, thank you very much, Dorothy. I must say your contribution to education of refugee communities has been legendary, been enormous at Hoyrod School, and I must say this university was benefiting of your work because many people came straight from Hoyrod School to this university and they are doing very well. So thank you for it. And I must say it's very difficult to imagine you in the retirement. I don't know what you are doing, but you are certainly not retired. Now, it's time to return to our keynotes. And our third keynote speaker is Associate Professor Jake Lynch, who is the chair of the Department of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of Sydney. Jake specializes for the last 20 years in peace journalism. He got many publications and achievements in this area. Allow me to mention that last year he was awarded the Luxembourg Peace Prize by the Schengen Peace Foundation of Europe. Please welcome Professor Lynch.
Thank you, Seb, and thank you everyone for inviting me. I might need a hand to find the PowerPoints. It's been a privilege to listen to the previous contributors, and I've been working on my forms. You know, we all got these forms when we came in, and we're supposed to write down things we've learned about the Hazara community, and certain areas where I've already topped up my knowledge and awareness, thanks to Dr. Ibrahimi and Professor Maley, for example. I'm now in a position to claim that my memory has been refreshed about Afghanistan and about the kind of country Afghanistan is. But it also behooves us, I think, to dwell for a while, to ponder what kind of country Australia is. Because today, of course, if you've been following what's been said and events in the Federal Parliament, there was a certain point where you could have run away with the idea that the kind of country Australia is could be summed up as insular, backward-looking, resentful and vindictive. But of course, as we all know, there is that Australia, but that is only one Australia. And there is another Australia, embodied perhaps by what we've just heard about Holroyd High School, which is open, curious, welcoming and fair-minded. And these Australias coexist. They coexist in our country, they may coexist in our communities, they may even coexist within each one of us. And what may be at stake, therefore, is how they are addressed and how each one may be activated by different stimuli, how they are translated into responses to other people, social responses, political responses. Heard a little bit about some of the unfortunate political responses that people in the community are living with just now. Now, what I'm planning to do, therefore, is to give you a glimpse of some of the research that I've been doing over recent years about different ways of presenting issues to people in the milieu of the news media. What I'm going to suggest is that there are certain distinctions in representation of issues affecting the Hazara community here in the news, which may play a role in activating either one of those two Australias and prompting and enabling the formation and transmission of differential social and political responses to the advantage or disadvantage of people here. What I'm going to be doing is to talk about, as Professor Ostowski just said, my particular interest of peace journalism. So peace journalism, or PJ as we call it, is the organising principle for a worldwide movement. It's a movement not only in scholarly research but also as a reform proposition, which is being taken up and worked on by civil society groups around the world. And reforms which you may think may be well overdue in our media here. It's a sobering thought, I think, for us that during the time we are meeting here, today's events in the Federal Parliament will be presented to the news audiences of Channel 7, Channel 9 and the ABC. And in what way will they be presented? Who will be speaking? And what will those people be saying? These are some of the operative distinctions, I think, which may influence which of those two Australias will come to the fore in responding to the events of the day. So I'm going to be presenting and hopefully sharing a little bit of some material that we used in this research on Australian news audiences several years ago now. This material was created in 2011, 7 years ago. So you may notice when we come to play it that some of the political personnel have changed. But I say that advisedly because, as I think you will also appreciate, a lot of the issues unfortunately haven't changed. So therefore I think it remains relevant. When I talk about peace journalism to somebody in the southern Philippines, for example, or to somebody in Lebanon, may have a sort of reality which, thankfully for us here in Australia, is at one remove. Indeed, it was my privilege a few years ago to be invited to Kabul to talk about peace journalism with journalists from all over Afghanistan. And that, of course, was very much an eye-opener for me about the realities and the exigencies of the lives of journalists there. But peace also means peaceful communities. It's also about what is conducive to peace in the community. Peaceful communities have a place of safety, security, respect and support for all their members. And so what is at stake? What are the issues which affect whether our communities can be made safe and for whom? And that's really the kind of level at which these distinctions operate here in Australia. And one of the very familiar contexts in which they operate, of course, is about discussions regarding political responses to issues of immigration, issues of refugee flows that Professor Maley was presaging as a likely corollary of political events in Afghanistan, and issues of people seeking sanctuary, seeking asylum, seeking to join us in our community in order to establish a new life away from the well-founded fear of persecution. So in the study that we did, the way we conducted it was that we went and partnered with a TV station that does news, television news, in 4 countries. We went to the Philippines, South Africa and Mexico, but we began here in Australia and we partnered with SBS. And SBS does a very good news programme, as you know, World News Australia. And it was the journalists from World News Australia who worked with us to create this research material. And the research material took the form of 2 versions of the same stories. And the first version had usually been broadcast. It was very close to what had been broadcast. It was a time when, then as now, issues of immigration and political responses to immigration and asylum seekers were prominent in the news, almost invariably contributed from the Canberra Bureau, because the study period coincided with a period when Parliament was sitting, and so therefore that's a very busy time for the Canberra Bureau. Syndrome I recognise well. I used to be a political correspondent myself before I became an academic, so these are political correspondents. And of course their contacts books are full of political speakers, and that is reflected in the content of their news. But a pattern began to be evident, of course, which is that while these stories that SBS was broadcasting to its audience were ostensibly about asylum seekers, one looked down the list of speakers who were interviewed to make these pieces of television and looked in vain for any actual asylum seekers, looked in vain for any member of any community who has come to Australia under the Refugee Convention, as is their right, to seek asylum, to seek refuge from the well-founded fear of persecution and make a new life here with us in our community. So those speakers tended to be completely absent. So that was the main distinction that we built back into the research material. What difference does it make if a news audience is given the opportunity to meet somebody who has gone through that process? I say the word meet in inverted commas. I mean meet, of course, in a symbolic domain, the symbolic domain of media, but given the opportunity to speak in their own right about their own experiences from their own perspective. And I think you would agree with me, that is all too rare in television news portrayals of the kind of issues that our last speaker was referring to. How should Australia offer a welcome to people in that position? So we operated with a set of distinctions. Yes, there we are. Set of distinctions. These are the PJ evaluative criteria. So in producing these two versions, we wanted to code them as either including or excluding these factors. So the number one, as you can see there, is does the reporting explore the backgrounds and contexts of conflict formation? Now, what you've got there is a picture of the leader of an armed group in the Philippines, who was another person who was speaking in the research, in that branch of the research. And of course, in that part of the world, that's what that can mean. In our part of the world, what it can mean is any information, such as the information I've been reminding us of here, and the previous speakers as well. What is the background and context that people leave behind when they take the only rational step and leave their homes to seek refuge? Does it give the views of all rival parties? Well, in these pieces of reporting from the Canberra Bureau, you could see front bench spokespersons from the different political parties. You might even catch a glimpse of Tony Abbott in among there somewhere, but I know he was actually only in the first version. I'm just going to read the second version. I'm not going to subject you to that. Does it have creative ideas for conflict resolution, peacemaking and peacekeeping? And once again, this gentleman here in the Philippines is discussing these creative ideas, but the proposition that people can arrive here as a community from a conflict-affected country such as Afghanistan and make a new life here to the extent of successfully putting their children through school and to university, that could be a creative idea for conflict resolution, peacemaking and peacekeeping. It's all about context. Does it expose cover-up attempts and culprits on all sides? What we heard this morning was, I suppose, an exercise in finger pointing, trying to say it's those people over there, they're the problem. They're the problem. Do something to them and you will solve the problem. And thankfully, we can find different responses to that. And does it pay attention to peace stories and post-war developments? That is, stories of people who've made a success of moving into a phase of their lives beyond the reach of armed conflict. That could be very important. I'm going to speed up a little bit. This is a summary of some of the responses that we got to the story in the Australian branch of the study about these issues of political responses to asylum. This was the phase when, as you will probably recall, a certain leader of a certain party was going around saying, "Stop the boats." So these are the kind of issues that we were dealing with. The participants in the study were divided into two groups: those who saw the standard version, the version that had already gone to air in this case, and those who saw the adjusted version, which I'll come to in a minute. And the methods we use, a range of methods, people who were viewing these materials would note down their thoughts and feelings as they were watching them, something called a thought listing protocol. They would fill in questionnaires about how they were feeling at the time, before and after each story, and they, in some cases, would join in focus groups for a more in-depth discussion. So we took the results from all these different methods of data collection and compared them, and what we found was that the viewers of the standard version of this story felt more hopeless than they had done at the beginning. They increased in their astonishment, revulsion, contempt, distaste, anger, disdain, scorn, and downheartedness. And these emotions were usually directed towards members of the political party at the opposite from their own sympathy. And we deliberately controlled for that. We assembled groups of people to view this material from different walks of life, different political allegiances, different income groups, and so on, to have a cross-section of the Australian community to whom we would play this. And viewers of the adjusted version, which I hope I'm about to be able to play you, found that their sense of hopelessness decreased, and what was most noticeable was that they had more empathy. And that, I think, is a key factor in whether either one or the other of what I have suggested are these two different Australias is evoked and activated in the mode of presentation of some of these issues. So I might need to call on some technical assistance here to find the video, but there is a video which we hopefully will come to. Is anybody going to come and help? Yeah, okay. So this is the adjusted version. Yes, okay. That's all right. This is going to be the adjusted version of this story. And bear in mind that it starts life as a story from Canberra. It starts life as a story by a political correspondent from the politics section of SBS News, but as you will see, it then veers off into some rather different material.
Good evening and welcome to World News Tonight. Australian Greens have called for more resources for the Immigration Department to process claims for refugee status by asylum seekers in detention. They say it's inhumane to lock people up in overcrowded conditions. It follows the leak of an internal memo asking for staff to be transferred from other government departments.
The Greens say there's an urgent need to speed up the processing of asylum claims, and the Immigration Department is right to request the transfer of staff from across the government bureaucracy.
There is a real need to have more resources allocated to the Immigration Department to get through the processing of people's claims.
The Coalition's obtained a letter from the head of immigration asking to borrow employees from the Agriculture Department. Andrew Metcalf says with more asylum seekers arriving, the department is approaching the point where we will not be able to meet this demand from existing internal staff.
In the last 4 months, the number of people who have been staying in detention for more than 3 months has increased by a shocking 250%.
Labor concedes there are significant pressures.
Part of that is that we're trying to process people more quickly, and that requires more staff. Part of it is that we are rejecting more applications for asylum.
But of the more than 7,000 arrivals over the past 2 years, only about 250 have been or will be sent back where they came from. Most are found to be fleeing a genuine fear of persecution in their country of origin. Ali Jafari arrived on Christmas Island last November after spending a week on a boat from Indonesia. Now living in Western Sydney, he says he had to flee the Taliban and paid people smugglers over $7,000 for the journey.
Well, I was working for international community in my country, and the situation for me was quite worse because I was Hazara and I was Shia, and I was supporting government and United Nations and Western countries in my country.
So you couldn't get to a United Nations office in Afghanistan?
No, in Afghanistan we didn't have chance.
Demonstrators in Sydney in favour of welcoming asylum seekers are in a majority, according to opinion polls, even though most Australians also say they're against accepting arrivals by boat.
Australians generally are supportive, 52% support asylum seekers actually coming to Australia as immigrants.
Ali Jafari says he wants to be a valued member of Australian society.
I want to prove that Australia did not make a mistake by giving me a permanent residency in here. I would like Australia to be proud of me.
Ali also wants
September 26th, and then the settlement construction fees issue.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. That was near the end. It was near the end. I think you get the point. The point is that there's a little trip down memory lane, even to the extent that we had a different government, because of course Labour were the government then, and the coalition was the opposition. But how similar and familiar the issues sound when presented from the Canberra point of view, through the prism of this kind of Canberra rivalries. And it's almost like a little archive of some of the kind of outrageously deceitful and misleading statements that have been served up to the Australian community over the years. So here was a reference in the interview with Mr. Jafari to the famous furphy that people in countries affected by violent conflict, what they should actually do is report to the United Nations office and join the queue. It's as if it's a queue at the bar to get a schooner of tuies. The ultimate faux pas in Australian culture is to push in to the queue, you see. So that was that one. But of course, as you will know, for Mr. Jafari, that would have entailed taking a road trip to Kabul, which would have been just about the most dangerous thing he could have done. And if we think back to other countries at that time, which were sources of refugee flows to Australia, in Iraq, for example, the United Nations headquarters was destroyed in the most horrendous bombing quite soon after the start of the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime. Even in Sri Lanka, during the decisive and extremely bloody final phase of that country's civil war, the United Nations was bitterly criticised for evacuating its offices in Kilinoki, in the northeast of the country, which is the area where most Tamils live. So in all these places, to demand that people kind of knock on the door of their local United Nations office and join the queue was not only unrealistic, but also very cynically put forward by people who either did know or should have known better. But here's the piece of good news. I mentioned that this material was played to participants in this study from across a very large range of social and political backgrounds in Australia. It was very much to a cross-section of the Australian community, but they all shared certain important aspects of response, namely that they responded to the rare phenomenon of somebody in Ali Jafari's position who has gone through this experience, as I know many of you have. They responded to that uniformly with a much increased sense of empathy and with a much greater willingness to consider and value non-violent responses, policy responses, which would be geared towards welcoming new arrivals in our community, meeting their needs, and ensuring that they could take their place in safety and security along with the rest of us. And that was a pattern that held good across the different study areas. In all the peace journalism versions, as I call them, the ones like the ones you just watched, in all of those, recorded fear among viewers decreased. People reported that their sense of fear had gone down and that hope and empathy had increased. Mr. Jafari we labelled as a protagonist, somebody who has his own story to tell and who is a carrier of a subjugated narrative. That is to say, what he says about himself is a version of events which is very seldom heard. It's usually marginalised or excluded, but that won people's attention for what he had to say. You could almost see people visibly starting off leaning back, watching telly, as probably many of us do, and then leaning forward as they engaged with this very articulate man and what he was saying. That led them to consider and value non-violent responses. In Australia, that meant compassionate treatment of asylum seekers. Even in Mexico, it meant initiatives to transform the so-called war on drugs. So it is a phenomenon that I think can be witnessed in action, whereby people's responses are activated in a differential fashion, depending upon certain aspects of the way the situation is presented to them. In particular, the relationship between the way the problem is diagnosed on the one hand and what can therefore be seen as an appropriate treatment recommendation on the other. So if you exclude from consideration anything of the life story of someone like Ali Jafari, then you can be addressed, as people were being addressed in Parliament this morning, on the basis of saying, oh, we'll just keep them out and everything will be all right. Whereas if you are given the opportunity to engage with his story and to consider what it means and to put yourself in his shoes, you are altogether more likely to be in favour of policies that provide a proper and fitting welcome reflective of the best of Australian values.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lynch. It was great to listen to a different point of view and to see how information could be manipulated to impact on your perceptions of different communities. And in a way, Professor Lynch dealt with quality of news and manipulation of news long term before the term fake news entered public domain. Now, our last keynote speaker is Mr. Ahmed Shuja Jamel, who is editor-in-chief of Georgetown Public Policy Review, Georgetown University, beautiful university. I spent a year there, and I wish everyone could. Jamal is a Fulbright scholar from Afghanistan. He also served as a director of development at the American University in Afghanistan. He got quite a career in human rights. He worked as a researcher for Human Rights Watch. He also established in Afghanistan the first digital media agency. He published in many newspapers, including Al Jazeera, BBC World, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, and Associated Press. Please welcome Mr. Jamal.
Thank you, Dr. Ozowski. That was a very generous introduction. This is going to be a speech in 3 stories. Story number 1 is that as I made my way from Kabul to Australia over the last 10 days, I've actually lost 2 phones. And so as a result, you can actually conclude that I'm your panelist, the hapless panelist that has to schlep around a large laptop to make his remarks today here. Story number 2 is about, and because this is a forum about human rights and about immigration and refugees, is about an Afghan who goes to California, and there he decides to stay for a while, decides to apply for asylum, Unfortunately, it doesn't work out, so he has to return to Afghanistan. And there, people ask him, so Mr. So-and-so, what did you do while you were in California? And Mr. So-and-so said, I used to work at Apple. And they asked, so what did you do at Apple? And he lifts up his phone and he points to the apple and he says, do you see the apples on your phones? I took bites off the apples. So after, it's a really tough act to follow Professor Lynch, Professor Maley, and Dr. Ibrahimi. All of them are illustrious academics who've done excellent work. Everything I'm going to do tonight is going to be taking bites off the apple. But also, given the fact that I'm supposed to be talking about a vision for the future, and since I didn't know that I would lose 2 phones on this trip, I'm not really known for having a clairvoyant ability. So please bear with me as I start with the third story. But the third story, before I do that, I've been asked to tell you that the hashtag for this event tonight is hashtag Hazara Rights Now. Hashtag Hazara Rights Now. You're encouraged to tweet about this, Facebook about this, Instagram about this, and if the technology works, there's also a possibility that your tweets and hashtags might be displayed up here. That depends on the organizers, but Hazara Rights Now is the hashtag. The third story is that a few years ago, I think this was end of 2015, early 2016, as Afghanistan was talking about a peace settlement or a political settlement with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who is a very well-known character in the Afghan political scene of the last 40 years, I would say. And he's been involved in all kinds of activities inside Afghanistan, not least of which is shelling with rockets the capital of the country, in which he at that point was the prime minister or the president. I forget which title was appropriate. So there's credible evidence of gross human rights violations against Mr. Hekmatyar, spanning a career of 40 years, 4 decades, including his foot soldiers having blown up a number of French soldiers. So in the end, late 2015, early 2016, there was conversation about bringing him in from the cold, from a long career of being the opposition, of being fighting and being in the cold, into the fold of the political process, in other words, mainstreaming him. And so as conversations were happening about the political settlement of Mr. Hekmatyar, the French were expected to create some form of resistance because they had lost soldiers, and Mr. Hekmatyar was not about to apologize or do any form of reparations or be held accountable for the loss of French soldiers in Afghanistan. So around this time, there was a reception at the embassy of one Nordic country that shall go unnamed. And after about an hour, when everybody had food and everybody was properly had partaken of the libations, we were talking about Mr. Hekmatyar, and the ambassador of this country leaned towards us and he said, do not expect my country to take a stance against Hekmatyar or against the political settlement with Mr. Hekmatyar. I think from this, we can conclude a number of things, which are part of, I think, the latest cycle of developments inside Afghanistan, which starts around 2009-2010, which was the start of the military disengagement from Afghanistan. The drawdown, the French were among the first to draw down and completely take their soldiers out, but the Americans did a quick surge and then they're now drawing out, and everybody else was drawing out as well. This was also accompanied by a transition in which the economy was going off the cliff. There were many difficulties. The economy that was sustained by billions of international dollars was now having to run on much smaller amount of money. But also, in addition to that, there was also what was happening politically, which was, I think, epitomized by the comments of this Western ambassador who said, do not expect my country to take a political stance against the mainstreaming of Hekmatyar, who has a long and illustrious career in human rights violations. And that was that the international community was also disengaging from human rights in Afghanistan. And if you followed some of the major international conferences about Afghanistan, starting with 2012 in Tokyo, which was followed by the Tokyo Mutual Accountability Framework, in which the Afghan government committed to a number of benchmarks, a number of activities that they would accomplish, and the international community committed, in return for the accomplishment of those activities, support militarily and financially and all kinds of other support. So 2012, Tokyo Mutual Accountability Framework, 2015, which was a London conference after President Ghani was inaugurated. This is after the drawdown that began in 2009-2011. This was after the beginning of this was at the beginning of the economic sort of downturn in Afghanistan, but also in 2015 when the London conference took place. It was also the beginning, in fact, of the human rights disengagement. Because the commitments, human rights commitments that the Afghan government had as part of the Tokyo Mutual Accountability Framework were completely eradicated. And the SMAF, which stands for some sort of other mutual accountability framework, that was agreed upon as a result of the London conference, had far fewer human rights commitments from the Afghan government. And so the international community was not really holding the Afghan government to the same standards for human rights, protections of human rights as they had in the past. And so what this does to us in this conversation is that there is a severely diminished role for the international community in human rights in Afghanistan. And what that does mean is that the Afghan government now is the sole actor in town, the sole game in town in protecting and ignoring or deliberately violating human rights in Afghanistan. However, the same Nordic country that had said, do not expect us to put up an opposition against the deal with Hikmatyar, is now also among the group of EU countries that is asking the Afghan government to hold General Dosun to account for his alleged crimes. And that, I think, has a message for the Hazaras in Afghanistan. It has a message for the Hazaras here, but it also has a message for the allies of the Hazaras here. STARTS, University of Western Sydney, and all of the other organizations that are part of it, which is that international attention to Afghanistan, especially in human rights, may be diminished, but it is not gone. And that it is possible to lobby and to advocate in support of human rights and use the leverage you have as Australian citizens, whether you're of Hazara extraction or not, to put pressure and urge the Afghan government to protect human rights. And I think that is very important to keep in mind. And the rest of my conversation tonight is going to be centered around some of these themes that we talked about. But I think there are two main things that I'm going to sort of structure my conversations around this evening. Number one is that the fate of the Hazaras is inextricably connected to the fate of the country, to the fate of Afghanistan. If Afghanistan goes down, the Hazaras are going to suffer. If everybody else in Afghanistan suffers, then the Hazaras are going to suffer. And therefore, I think the orientation of the Hazaras in this room, the orientation of the Hazaras in Afghanistan, are going to be and must be by necessity to try to do whatever they can to try to slow what has been described as a slow march and a descent into greater chaos and lawlessness. Number two is for Hazaras, particularly for Hazaras outside of Afghanistan and inside of Afghanistan as well, is to, as perpetual victims of persecution, is to develop a more cosmopolitan consciousness of human rights. Professor Maley said that Hazara rights are human rights, and human rights are everybody's rights, including the rights of Tajiks, including the rights of Pashtuns, including the rights of Sikhs and every other community inside Afghanistan and communities in the countries where you have made your home here and now. And I think the events that are developing in Afghanistan currently are pushing all the communities in Afghanistan in the direction of a few common actors that are persecuting all of them. I think the Taliban are looking in cities where they've taken temporary or permanent control, not just for particular groups that they've targeted in the past, but individuals of all communities that are part of the government, that are part of the international nonprofit sector, that are part of other things. And so you're seeing persecution being done to all communities, Hazara and not Hazara. Although the Hazaras have their own vulnerabilities, and we continue to see that the Hazaras are targeted based on those vulnerabilities. But the Taliban are targeting everybody else as well. I have spoken to members of the Pashtun ethnic group who fled their communities and their villages from the districts of Jalalabad because of the persecution and the torment that they've suffered in the hands of ISIS, Daesh, in Afghanistan. And they're describing to me similar things done to them that Daesh has done in communities of Sarakun, in Mirza Olam, to Hazara villages. And that is because there's only a finite number of ways in which an oppressor can oppress multiple communities. And I think by developing what I call a more cosmopolitan consciousness of human rights, the Hazaras can actually create connections of synergy with other communities that are facing a common set of enemies. And I think Afghanistan is going towards a direction in which, although the Hazaras are facing particular persecution in certain regards, everybody else is facing persecution from a similar set of actors. And this is actually different from what happened in the 1990s during the Civil War, where every community persecuted every other community. And so the time right now is a lot more conducive than it has ever been to develop this kind of cross-cultural, cross-peoples, cross-ethnic synergies about human rights advocacy. And this will obviously require the Hazaras in Afghanistan to sort of, the Hazaras, as you've described, have always been sort of outside of the realm of power. They've always been objects of persecution, and I think this is the time for them to sort of change their orientation towards power, towards the government, from the outside looking in to an orientation in which they're inside and at the table, having a conversation with everybody else about human rights and about political development. Because if you work for a just and equitable society in Afghanistan, everybody benefits, so do you. Because the realization was that the fate of the Hazaras is inextricably connected to the fate of the country they live in. So based on all of this, I'm going to talk about what the Hazaras in Australia in particular can do about safeguarding the rights of Hazaras in Afghanistan. Number one is, I think, to integrate into the existing communities, the country, this state, this Australia, in which you've made your new home. Because we've seen that over the last couple of decades, the Hazara community has become functionally literate in how to live in Australia. You know how to use Centrelink, you know how to buy a house, you know how mortgages work, you know how to get into universities. But I think it's time for also to integrate into the financial, cultural, economic, and political life of Australia. To look beyond your communities. But I think as you do that, it is also important that you actually maintain very strong connections with Afghanistan. Because what happens is diaspora communities come with this concept or this image of what their country was like when they left, and they get locked into that image, whereas the community that they've left has moved on light years. And I think if you're going to be good advocates of Hazara human rights, I think you should also be extremely aware of what those human rights are and what the violations of those human rights are back in Afghanistan. Because as you may have seen, and a lot of you are probably from Jawhari, what happened in Jawhari was that there was the threat of the Taliban taking over this particular district, and the people mobilized, and they had conversations with the Taliban, and there have been multiple rounds of settlements with the Taliban that have averted crises. And I think what you see is that people at the local level, at the community level inside Afghanistan are much more open to compromise because they have to live with the consequences of compromise or the consequences of intransigence in which they do not compromise. But what communities outside of these local areas do is they stick to the intransigence because they're locked into the time capsule of what the country was when they left the country. And your stance can actually harm the communities that are at the front lines that are much more open to compromise. And I think, so that means integrate in Australia as much as we can, but also maintain a keen awareness of what is going on in Afghanistan, because first, do no harm. So have a more realistic picture of what the ground looks like, avoid the time capsule entrapment, and do advocacy that is realistic and informed by activities, developments on the ground. So for allies in Australia, I think I have a couple of things to say to organizations like STARTS, organizations like the University of Western Sydney, which I understand has been very welcoming to Hazara activists and students and youth leaders. I think this model of today is a very good model, because what it allows is instead of making the Hazaras, they've already been objects of persecution. Instead of making them objects of conversation of a policy in a vacuum, you're making them agents of that conversation, which relates to what Professor Lynch said in his presentation as well. But related to bringing Hazaras and giving them a voice, or helping them get a voice, is also to help the community integrate with the government, to liaise and interface with the government. Because communities that have been harmed persistently over generations with the government tend to carry with them a trauma associated with power and with those in government. And I think if you can help the Hazaras in Australia in their integration journey to interface with the government of Australia, I think you're helping them significantly, and you're helping strengthen the human rights in Australia, including elsewhere. And also, I think help Hazaras become spokespersons of more than just the issues relevant to refugees. Because that way the Hazaras can contribute, and they can show that they can contribute in political office, in elected representative capacities, and in other capacities in which they can actually listen to the advocacy that other Hazaras do, and that organization like STARTS does, and other organizations, communities across Australia do. So, a vision for the future of Hazara human rights, I think, has three components. Component number one is that Hazaras become, inside Afghanistan and outside, active agents of change and advocates for human rights of all, including non-Hazaras, inside Afghanistan and outside of Afghanistan, because we've developed a cosmopolitan consciousness of what human rights is, which is rights of everybody, including the non-Hazaras. Number two is a community in Australia that is fully integrated into the diasporas in Australia and elsewhere, in which they're fully integrated into their host communities, into the nations where they've made their homes. Number three is that they're spokespersons on Hazara issues, and also agents and spokespersons of issues that are non-Hazara, because you've integrated, you've become part of the communities, and you're speaking for the problems of those communities you live in. Now this seems like a very vague and a very long-term thing. This reminds us of that Latin/Greek phrase that says ars longa vita brevis, commonly translated as life is long, art is long and life is so short. The phrase is not meant to is not meant to bemoan the brevity of human life, but it's meant to evoke the enormity of the task that lies ahead in every human life. And I think in this case, we are realizing that Afghanistan, to become an equitable, democratic, just society, that we thought it would become in 2002 when the Taliban had left, is going to take generations. Because our problems are larger than we had thought when the Taliban were kicked out. And therefore, our vision for Hazara human rights in the future is also a vision of long term. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Donald, for your comments. In a way, it's interesting to listen to you talking about integration, and it's very important. I'm also a chair of Australian Council for Multicultural Affairs, and I'll be there on Monday talking exactly about integration. It's also very important when you talk about integrating into broader society, not to forget about your roots. You need to remember where you came from, you need to maintain your culture, you need to open your culture to others, but without having your culture, you are losing very important part of human dignity. You are losing very important part of where you are coming from, and it's important not only to you, but also to your children. But by all the way, you need to stay open, you need to join others, and you need to allow others also to join you. So thank you very much. Now it's your turn. Now we'll have a question time, and we still manage to have some time, although we run over time. So I would like to ask all the speakers, please, to come forward, take a seat there. And I think we have a microphone somewhere here, and possibly somebody will be helping me with these microphones here. So if you have a question, maybe put up your hand, and we'll take your question. When you're asking question only, also perhaps mention your name, or if you represent some kind of organization, mention where you are coming from. So I see we are having our panel here. Fantastic. So what about you? Would you like to join us? Jorge? Yeah, Jorge, come on. Yeah. You open it. important. Thank you. Okay, time for questions. I see a question in the back, but please, if we could have questions, not comments, considering shortness of time. Yes, please. Now, who is taking microphone? It's coming, okay. Wait a second, you will get microphone.
Yeah, my name is Barry Humphrey, and I'd like to congratulate Sam and the panel on presenting this, presenting very eloquently to us the problems in integrating a community such as the Hazara into Australia, and I'd like to congratulate you all on your approach to achieving this. And I go back a long way in this country when I'm 89, and I go back to the time when Greeks were coming to Australia, Italians were coming to Australia, and I grew up with a family of Greeks, Peter, Benny, Harry, Nicky and Jimmy, 5 boys, and we also had relationships with Italians. But listening to all that's being presented tonight and the problems of integration of people who have been suffering in all directions in their own country, and how do we help to assimilate them properly, it still comes across to me. I just wanted to ask the question now, what do you see as the future for the Hazaras in Afghanistan? Is there any hope for them becoming a member of the political establishment and having a say in running their own country?
Thank you. So the question is, what's the future of Hazaras in Afghanistan?
Thank you very much for asking this question at this time. I think the situation, as my friend Shuja Jamal mentioned, is extremely precarious. Since 2001, Hazaras, like most communities in Afghanistan, have been keen participants of the political and democratic process in the country. In general, I think they make a broader distinction between the political elites in the country who have been messing things up. It includes, among elites of the Hazaras, of the Pashtuns, of the Tajiks, and others, but a general willingness among the common population of the whole country to participate and use opportunities made available to them to make a difference, to open new opportunities for themselves and for their children. And related to this, Afghanistan has a new generation which is emerging socially, politically, and economically, and making huge cultural impact at the moment in Afghanistan now. That is hugely influential, forward-looking, and is also trying to tackle this divides along ethnic, religious, and regional lines. However, as we mentioned, and was very much discussed by William Mehdi, Professor Mehdi, Afghanistan as a country has been very much shaped by forces which are outside its borders. And some of those forces are presently posing challenges which are outside the control of the Hazaras, the Pashtuns, or all the civilian communities on their own. So as a result of this, I think for the new opportunities which have been made available, the new gains which have been made since 2001 to be sustained, we also need sustained international commitment, probably not in the same level of military or financial commitment that we have been seeing so far, but a greater level of consistency in the level of commitment, but also in terms of commitment to human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And that, I think, will go a long way in giving a new generation to open up and use opportunities which have been made available to make a difference.
Perhaps If you could maybe keep the microphone a bit closer to your mouth so people can hear it better.
I think the Hazaras are participating in the government in Afghanistan, but I also think that even though access to government power has given them a certain level of protection, access to a government power in a government that itself is struggling to maintain control in large parts of the country is also opening the many members of the Hazara community who are part of the government to new ways of vulnerability that didn't exist in the past. I think that's important. The other thing that's important is that even though there are active and enthusiastic participants of civil society, of the government, of the democratic process, there's also a strong sense of disenfranchisement among the Hazara youth. But over the last few weeks that I spent in Afghanistan talking to the youth, but also talking to the political and religious elite, that disenfranchisement has actually crept into the political elite as well, who are part of the government, who share the power. So yes, they're there, but there's also these attitudes of disenfranchisement that are creeping up into the highest echelons of Hazara society. That's number one. The other thing is, but yes, absolutely. There's a statistic, I think, of dubious provenance, that 64% of Afghan population is below the age of 35, which I think is right in the ballpark. And this energy is going to bubble up, like it or not. This is the inexorable force of society. If there's even a semblance of stability in the country, there's going to be creativity, there's going to be cross-fertilization of ideas, and there's going to be a lot of energy that's going to be bubbling into the surface in Afghanistan. And some of that is going to be Hazara energy.
Just a few thoughts. I go to a lot of conferences on Afghanistan. And if I go to a conference where the participants are predominantly of Western background, I know it's only going to be a matter of time before someone gets up and starts quoting Rudyard Kipling. You're lying half dead on Afghanistan's plain, blah, blah, blah. Kipling never set foot in Afghanistan. And the 19th century and its history is a poor guide to what Afghanistan is like in the 21st century. And some hope lies in that. No country in the world has been more affected by globalization in the last 17 years than Afghanistan, since 2001. Afghanistan has gone from being incredibly isolated during the period of Taliban domination to being a country in which millions of people now have mobile phones. And the most arresting statistic which I've seen from Afghanistan in recent times was from last year's Asia Foundation opinion survey, which suggested that 56% of households in rural Afghanistan have access to television. Now, when that begins to happen, we don't know exactly what the effects are going to be, but we know there will be dramatic effects. Just as Australia was dramatically affected by the advent of television as a medium of communication, so Afghanistan is being affected as well. And this can have a downside, but it can provide a source of opportunity as well. And the crucial questions in Afghanistan are whether the forces of instability that are creating so much trouble at the moment for Hazaras and other members of the Afghan community can be effectively addressed in such a way as then liberates these other kind of forces of change to play a positive role for the future. And I have the one point of light in what's often a very dark situation is the young people of Afghanistan. When I go to Afghanistan, the young people I encounter are as bright as you will find in any country in the world. They are as impressive as you will find in any country in the world. There's still a dead hand of the past resting on them. And it's a matter of potentially quite some time before that dead hand of the past can be eliminated. But there are bases upon which one shouldn't simply despair about what Afghanistan has to offer. You know, I think of that wonderful line from one of Oscar Wilde's characters, we are all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars.
I see, yes, please, here. If we could have a microphone here in the first row.
My name is Kadim Fayaz. I'm a member of Hazara community in Sydney. It's a very great honor to be here today. Of course, Hazaras are having a lot of issues and troubles in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and as well here. I don't want to go to Afghanistan and Pakistan, but I would like to ask that how can we prevent the Hazara refugees not to be the victimized of the policymakers, like tough law against terrorists, or like under the name of security. How can we prevent that the Hazara refugees, which are very genuine and refugees, don't be the victimized of these laws and these politicians? Definitely, we will not consider today's what happened in Parliament. That's not Australia. That's only the opinion of one person. It's not the first time, it happened before as well. But I see like tough law or delay process for the citizenship of Hazara refugees, taken up to 3-4 years, and a lot of other Hazara refugees facing uncertainty, and they've been rejected from IAA and as well the many other court, and really they are in a very pathetic condition psychologically. How can we prevent this, and what's the solution, or how we can help the Hazara refugees in Australia? Thank you.
Yes, it was one person in the Parliament, but very bigoted and very ill-informed, but I think the response was overwhelming. Yes, but who would like to respond?
As you can tell from my accent, I'm originally from England, and Britain this year is celebrating the centenary of the very important breakthrough achieved by women of getting the vote in elections. It came in some way behind Australia and a long way behind New Zealand. And of course, before that, there were centuries when only men had the vote. So my proposal is that from this centenary onwards, only women should have the vote. Because if only women had the vote, then the government of Australia, the government of the UK, and the incumbents of the White House would all be from the opposite party to the present one. Which is a roundabout way of saying that one of our problems is toxic masculinity. And there's a very good case for saying that toxic masculinity is at the root of a lot of these problems. Look, I mean, there is a constituency in Australia for punitive measures against refugees and punitive measures against asylum seekers, because the insular, fearful, resentful, vindictive Australia has been successfully evoked and politically mobilised for gain. And what is the gain? Well, the gain can be distilled in the agenda of the Turnbull government of corporate tax cuts, which is to shove more money into the pockets of the already rich and powerful. And against that, we have no option but to stand together and make common cause. In making common cause, we need to figure out how to relate to each other as human beings, not as labels, not as statistics, but the distinctions in representation that I've put forward this evening would be a modest and small portion of that in the specific domain of television news. But we need to press for those opportunities across the piece. It seems to me there's no other option to turn the tide of the punitive and to strengthen the inclusive instead.
If I could make a political science comment here. The problem we face is that the perception within the strategists of the major political parties in Australia is that there are swinging votes to be won by stoking up fear of refugees and asylum seekers and of people arriving by boat. The interesting thing is that if you do a detailed statistical analysis of survey evidence, view is not sustained. In 2013, votes arriving in the period immediately before the election, Thus, it was a period in which one would have expected that this would be an enormously rewarding strategy for the opposition to pursue. In fact, when you looked in detail at the data, what you discovered was that for more than three-quarters of the electorate, the issue of boats and refugees was at best a third-order issue. It came in well behind taxation, economic policy, health, education. But the really interesting statistic was that the issue was worth to the coalition parties less than 1 percentage point of the vote. Less than 1 percentage point. So in a sense, what we need is a situation in which a government tries its best to win an election with every dirty trick and every nasty piece of rhetoric and still loses. And at that point, you might have an opposition leader capable of developing the spine to take on some of these challenges. Because at the moment, the problem is that the opposition is just dead